You think silence means nothing is happening. That's the first mistake. Because when you're dealing with someone who is highly perceptive, someone who reads people beyond just words, silence is not empty, it's active. While most people are focused on what's being said, they're focused on what's not being said. They're watching your timing, your tone, your facial tension, the small shifts in your posture. They notice the pause before you respond, the slight change in your voice when you're not being fully honest, the difference between when you're engaged and when you're just pretending to be. And here's where it gets interesting. They don't interrupt you. They don't call you out every time. They let it play out. That's what makes this dangerous if you're on the other side of it. Because you assume everything is fine. You assume if something was wrong, they would say it. But that assumption is exactly what allows the distance to grow without you realizing it. They are constantly collecting data. Every interaction, every inconsistency, every moment where your words and actions don't align, it all gets logged. Not in a dramatic way, not emotionally out of control, but in a calm, observational way. They're trying to understand your patterns. Are you consistent? Are you genuine? Or are you just showing up when it's convenient for you? And the truth is, most people underestimate how much they reveal in small moments. You might think it's just a joke, just a tone, just a quick response. But to someone who is paying attention at that level, those small things are not small. They are indicators. They show intention. They show respect or lack of it. Now here's the part most people miss. Just because they understand you doesn't mean they agree with you. And just because they stay doesn't mean they're okay with everything. In fact, many times they stay because they're giving you space to correct it. They're watching to see if you become more aware, more consistent, more real. But if that shift doesn't happen, the conclusion starts forming quietly in the background. No confrontation, no dramatic speech. Just a gradual shift in how they see you. And once perception changes at that level, it's very hard to reverse, because now every new action you take gets filtered through that updated understanding of who you are. So while you're thinking everything is normal, they're recalibrating. While you believe your behavior goes unnoticed, they're connecting patterns. And while you assume silence means acceptance, it actually means observation. By the time you finally notice something feels different, they've already seen enough to make a decision. You just weren't paying attention. Most people think disrespect has to be loud to matter. They imagine arguments, insults, obvious conflict. But that's not how it actually works, especially with someone who is highly emotionally aware. Disrespect is usually quiet. It shows up in tone, in timing, in the way you respond when it's inconvenient for you to care. And that's exactly why it's so often missed, because it hides inside normal conversation. It's the moment you brush off what they're saying like it's not important. It's when you respond with sarcasm instead of sincerity. It's when you're physically present but mentally somewhere else, giving just enough attention to get by. To most people, these moments don't seem like a big deal. They pass quickly, they're forgotten. But to someone who is paying attention at a deeper level, those moments stand out, because respect, to them, isn't about big gestures. It's about consistency. It's about how you show up in the small interactions, especially when there's nothing to gain. And when that consistency breaks, it sends a clear signal. Not necessarily that you're a bad person, but that your priorities are somewhere else. Here's where the misunderstanding happens. You might think, I didn't mean anything by it, and that may be true. But intent doesn't erase impact. What matters is how your behavior is experienced, not how it was intended. And when dismissiveness or emotional distance becomes a pattern, it stops being accidental. It starts becoming your default. They won't always react in the moment. That's what confuses people. There's no immediate pushback, no visible frustration. So you assume everything is fine. But internally, something is shifting. They're starting to feel less valued, less understood, less connected. Not because of one big moment, but because of repeated small ones. And those small moments add up faster than you think. Each one chips away at trust. Each one reinforces the idea that they're not being fully seen or respected. And once that idea takes hold, it changes how they engage with you. They become more reserved, more cautious, less open, not as a punishment, but as a natural response to what they're experiencing. Now here's the critical part. Emotional neglect doesn't feel dramatic from the outside. There's no clear event you can point to and say, that's where it went wrong. It's subtle, it's gradual. But its effect is powerful because it creates distance without confrontation. You might still be talking, still interacting, still maintaining what looks like a normal connection. But underneath that, the depth is fading, the trust is weakening, the emotional investment is slowly being pulled back. And by the time you notice that something feels off, it's not because of one thing you did recently. It's because of a pattern that's been building over time. A pattern of moments where respect wasn't fully there, where attention wasn't fully present, where connection wasn't fully valued. That's the reality most people don't see. Disrespect isn't always explosive. Sometimes it's quiet, repeated, and almost invisible until it's too late to correct it. Most people expect that if something is wrong, it will be addressed immediately. They think awareness leads to confrontation, but that's not always how it works, especially with someone who processes things internally before they ever bring it to the surface. Instead of reacting in the moment, they step back, they observe, they give space, not just to you, but to the situation itself. And this is where people misread what's happening. They take patience as approval. They assume that if there's no complaint, there's no problem. But what's actually happening is very different. They are giving chances, just not in a way that's obvious. They're watching to see if patterns correct themselves. They're paying attention to whether your actions align over time, not just in isolated moments. Because for them, one mistake doesn't define you. One off day doesn't determine everything. They understand that people are inconsistent at times. So instead of reacting emotionally to every issue, they look for repetition. They look for patterns. Is this behavior occasional or is it becoming normal? Is there effort to improve or is everything staying the same? That process takes time. And during that time, they remain calm on the outside. No arguments, no pressure, no dramatic reactions. But internally, they're evaluating. Every repeated behavior becomes another piece of evidence. Not in a judgmental way, but in a way that helps them understand what they're actually dealing with. And here's the part most people overlook. Giving chances doesn't mean lowering standards. It means allowing room for change. It means they're hoping you'll become more aware without needing to be forced into it. They want to see natural growth, not behavior that only changes when it's confronted. But if that growth doesn't happen, the meaning of those chances starts to shift. What was once patience becomes realization. What was once understanding becomes clarity. They begin to see that what they're experiencing isn't temporary, it's consistent. And once something is seen as consistent, it's no longer something they feel they need to fix. At that point, something subtle changes in how they engage. They may still be present, still communicating, still acting normal on the surface, but the emotional investment starts to pull back. They stop expecting things to improve. They stop trying to read deeper into your actions. Not because they don't care, but because they've already gathered enough information. And the reason this often goes unnoticed is because there's no clear signal, no moment where they say, this is your last chance. No deadline, no warning. The chances were already given, just quietly, over time, in moments you didn't realize were being measured. From your perspective, everything might feel steady. Nothing seems drastically wrong. But from their perspective, a decision is slowly forming. Not based on emotion alone, but based on repeated observation. And once that decision reaches a certain point, it becomes very difficult to reverse, because now it's not about one situation anymore. It's about a pattern that has already been understood. And when someone reaches that level of clarity, they don't need to argue about it. They don't need to explain it in detail. They simply adjust their behavior accordingly. So while it may look like nothing is happening, something very important is unfolding beneath the surface. Chances are being given, not announced, and by the time you realize they existed, they may already be gone. At the beginning, it doesn't feel like a problem. Being there for someone, understanding them, listening deeply, these things come naturally. There's no resistance, no sense of burden. In fact, it often feels like a strength. The ability to connect, to absorb what someone else is feeling, to make them feel heard, that's something most people value. And for a while it works, but over time, something starts to shift. Not all at once, not in a dramatic way. It builds slowly. Because when one person is consistently giving emotional energy and the other is mostly receiving, the balance starts to tilt. And imbalance, when it continues long enough, creates pressure. Here's the part most people don't recognize. Emotional energy isn't unlimited. It feels like it is at first, because there's willingness, there's care, there's intention, but even the most patient, understanding person has a threshold. And that threshold isn't based on one big moment, it's based on accumulation. Every time they listen without being heard in return, it adds up. Every time they support without feeling supported, it adds up. Every time they put aside their own emotional needs to make space for someone else's, it adds up. And none of these moments seem critical on their own. But together, they create a pattern that becomes harder and harder to ignore. The exhaustion that follows isn't physical, it's internal. It's the feeling of constantly giving without enough coming back to restore that energy. And when that happens, the connection starts to feel different. What once felt natural begins to feel heavy. What once felt fulfilling starts to feel one-sided. Now, here's where the misunderstanding happens. From the outside, nothing looks dramatically wrong. There's still communication. There's still interaction. But the depth behind it begins to fade. Because when someone reaches that level of emotional fatigue, they don't usually react with confrontation. They react with distance, not aggressive distance. Not obvious withdrawal, just a quiet reduction in how much they invest. They start sharing less. They stop going as deep. They become more selective with their time and energy. And this isn't done to create tension. It's done to protect what's left. Because at a certain point, continuing the same pattern doesn't feel sustainable. It feels draining. And when something consistently drains you without being restored, the natural response is to pull back. Not all at once, but in stages. First, the expectations change. Then the effort changes. And eventually, the connection itself starts to change. Not because of a single decision made in the moment, but because of a gradual realization that the balance isn't there. And by the time this becomes visible, it's usually already been happening for a while. The signs were there, just subtle. Less enthusiasm, less emotional openness, less willingness to carry the weight of the relationship alone. This is what emotional exhaustion really looks like. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's quiet, steady, and progressive. And once it reaches a certain point, it doesn't reverse easily. Because when someone starts protecting their energy instead of giving it freely, it means they've already felt what happens when they don't. Most people expect endings to be loud. They expect arguments, emotional conversations, clear signals that something is about to break. They think if a connection is ending, there will be a moment they can point to a final discussion, a visible conflict, something that explains it. But that expectation is exactly why this kind of exit goes unnoticed until it's already happened. Because when someone has been observing, processing, and gradually detaching over time, the decision doesn't happen in one moment. It happens in phases. By the time it reaches the surface, it's already complete internally. There's no need for a dramatic ending, because for them, the ending has already taken place long before anything changes externally. It starts subtly. The energy shifts. Conversations become shorter, less engaged. The depth that used to be there starts to fade. They're still present, but not in the same way. There's less curiosity, less emotional involvement, less effort to keep things flowing. And if you're not paying close attention, it's easy to miss. It doesn't look like rejection, it looks like normal variation. But underneath that, something very specific is happening. They are creating space, not in a way that demands attention, but in a way that reduces dependency. They're adjusting their habits, their expectations, their level of attachment. It's a quiet preparation for distance. And here's what makes this so difficult to detect. There's no announcement, no moment where they say, "This is changing." Because from their perspective, there's nothing left to explain. They've already processed it. They've already understood the pattern. They've already reached a conclusion about what the connection is and what it's not. So instead of discussing it, they act on it, gradually, calmly, without resistance. They stop initiating as much. They stop investing in deeper conversations. They respond, but they don't expand. And over time, that reduced engagement becomes the new normal. From the outside, it can feel confusing. There's no clear reason, no obvious conflict. Just a sense that something is different, something is missing, and the instinct is often to look for a recent cause, something that just happened. But the reality is, the cause isn't recent, it's accumulated. By the time you start questioning it, they're already further ahead in the process. Emotionally, they've already stepped back. Mentally, they've already accepted the distance. What you're noticing is not the beginning, it's the result. And when it reaches the final stage, it's not explosive, it's quiet. Communication becomes minimal. Interaction becomes occasional. Presence becomes optional. There's no need for closure in the traditional sense, because for them, closure already happened internally. That's why it feels like a disappearance rather than an ending. There's no single moment you can hold on to. No clear line where everything changed. Just a gradual fading that eventually becomes absence. And the reason it happens this way is simple. When someone has already processed everything in silence, there's nothing left they feel needs to be said out loud. By the time it reaches this point, most people are still trying to figure out what went wrong. They're looking for a moment, a mistake, something recent they can fix. But what they don't realize is that the decision didn't happen recently. It happened over time, quietly, through observation, through patterns, through repeated experiences that built a clear picture. And once that picture becomes clear enough, something changes in a very final way. It's not emotional in the way people expect. It's not reactive or impulsive. It's settled. It's understood. They've already gone through the questions, the doubts, the attempts to see things differently. They've already given chances, already adjusted expectations, already pulled back gradually. So when they finally decide to step away, it doesn't feel sudden to them. It feels complete. This is why return is so rare, because from your perspective, it may feel like something that can still be repaired. There's a belief that with the right words, the right explanation, the right effort, things can go back to how they were. But from their perspective, there is no back. What existed before was based on a version of understanding that no longer applies. They're not just leaving a situation, they're leaving the pattern they've already studied. And once a pattern is fully understood, it's very difficult to ignore it, or pretend it doesn't exist. Every past moment has already been processed and placed into context. Every inconsistency has already been acknowledged. So going back would mean overlooking something they've already accepted as real. Another thing most people miss is that the emotional separation doesn't happen at the moment of leaving. It happens long before that. By the time they physically step away, they've already done the emotional work of letting go. They've already adjusted to the idea of distance. They've already experienced what it feels like to not rely on that connection in the same way. So when the final step happens, it's not filled with hesitation. It's calm. It's clear. There's no urgency to explain. No need to revisit every detail. Not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered enough for them to process it fully on their own. And this is where many people get stuck. They try to re-enter at the point of exit, not realizing that the real shift happened much earlier. They focus on the moment they noticed the distance, while ignoring the long sequence of moments that created it. And without addressing that full pattern, any attempt to reconnect feels incomplete, because from their perspective, nothing new is being presented. It's the same behavior, the same dynamic, the same signals they've already analyzed. And without a clear, consistent change over time, not just in words, but in behavior, there's no reason for them to reconsider what they've already concluded. That's why, once they leave, it's rarely temporary. Not because they're unwilling to reconnect, but because they've already moved through the entire process internally. They're not reacting anymore. They've already responded. And when someone reaches that level of clarity, they don't circle back to confusion. They continue forward.